Well, next speaker is Jason Williams, and Jason is at the Northwest Watershed Research Center at USDA, or out of Boise, Idaho. And I'll tell you, Jason and Fred Pearson and these guys, they've done some really great hydrologic work in the Great Basin, and it's always look forward to seeing any of the papers that they have come out.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks for coming today to hear me talk about hydrology and erosion in Pinyon, Juniper, Woodlands in the Great Basin. Can you hear me okay? So as Rick said, much of the work that I'll show you today is stuff that Fred Pearson and I have been doing over the last decade or so, a lot of that with the SAGE STEP study. But we'll also bring in some work that we've done with other ARS locations in Burns, Oregon, in Reno, Nevada, and in Tucson, Arizona. So we'll be presenting today some experimental research from a number of sites in the Great Basin. You can see on the map here, these sort of span western juniper, Utah juniper, and some pinyon species there, as well as some sagebrush sites. Much of this work was funded through the Joint Fire Science Program and the National Interagency Fire Center and the BLM. The sites sort of span private as well as public lands managed by the BLM, and we're certainly thankful for both the private landowners and the BLM for access to these sites and some of the treatments that I'll talk about and how those affected hydrology. So I mentioned we'll be showing some field work or experimental research that we did. But we'll also be, well, most of that will be through a series of studies on rainfall simulation experiments at different plot scales. We also have some watershed scale research we've been doing in southwestern Idaho, looking at the impacts of juniper on the distribution of snow and water availability. So I'll talk about that research briefly. And then also some of the models we have that sort of give us an ability to expand our inferences across, say, plot to hill slope scales and even over at the watershed scale. So a good place to start anytime you're talking about hydrology and erosion processes is to think about these things in the context of process connectivity and spatial scales, because different processes are in play at different spatial scales. And this is just a conceptual model that we had in one of our papers in 2014. This conceptual model was really aimed at looking at changes in vegetation with woodland encroachment as you progress from the upper left in the sagebrush steppe figure to the far right, sort of a late succession woodland site. There's some very different structure to the vegetation, and that strongly influences hydrology and erosion processes, as you can see in the graphic there. Certainly for well-vegetated sites like you see in the upper photograph on the right, runoff and erosion are minimal, largely occurring at these sort of small bare patches through rain splash and sheet flow processes. Those are very inefficient mechanisms at moving water and sediment down slope. As we move more into what you see there for the woodland photo, where there's large expanses of bare ground, concentrated flow processes come into play. But more importantly, you have over those large areas of bare ground, as you see in the photographs there, these isolated bare patches that have rain splash, sheet flow, and concentrated flow active. So as you move into what we typically see in a woodland community with sort of these bare intercanopy areas, processes are well connected, and that strongly regulates the responses at the hill slope scale. And we'll sort of look at some data that illustrate these concepts. So this first slide here is from some of the data that we've collected, is for a sagebrush community in the Reynolds Creek experimental watershed in Idaho. Here we did some rainfall simulation experiments at the small plot scale and the large plot scale. And this slide's really intended for us to look at how runoff and erosion change across scales for a system like this, where we still have sort of this intact sagebrush and bunchgrass community sort of in the early stages of trees encroaching here. And so the small circles are representative of what we would refer to as our small plot rainfall simulation experiments. Those are half square meter plots, and you can see the runoff ratio shown there in yellow, ranging from 40% for, say, an individual shrub plot to somewhere around 60%. So that's the percent of water we applied in rainfall simulation experiments that ran off of the plot. So again, roughly 40 to 60%. And you can see the erosion rates there as well. As we move over to the larger circle, sort of representative of our large plots there, you can see that runoff ratio drops to 4% and erosion drops to 8 grams per square meter. So this is what we would typically expect for a well-vegetated site. Runoff and erosion decrease as you increase in spatial scale, largely associated with the cover and the sort of lack of connectivity of processes at play. So the photograph in the upper left here is something more typical of a woodland, although we know woodlands vary a lot based on some of the stuff that Rick's been talking about this morning and other speakers. But in this case, we're looking at a woodland with about 75% of the total area being the intercanopy between the trees, and about 75% of that area being bare ground. So this is not an uncommon condition for some woodlands or for woodland sites. That intercanopy area, of course, is made up of interspace, and the interspace can have various amounts of grass and bare soil, and then also the individual shrubs. And so what we've done across 3 different sites in the Great Basin is conduct rainfall simulation experiments on these small plots in the lower left. They're half square meter, much like the previous slide I showed. But also we've conducted experiments over the 13 square meter scale, sort of indicated there by the large oval in the upper photograph. And one of the ways we can understand how these sites function hydrologically is compare what we're measuring at the small plot scale to what we get at the large plot scale. And we can area weight small plot values into the larger plot scale and just see how things change across spatial scales. That's really what we're trying to do here. And interesting, what we see as we move from the small plots up to the larger plots, runoff typically is unchanged. And so it's, makes you ask what's going on there. You're getting the same amount of runoff over the larger scale as the small plot scale. But what's important to note there is that the way the runoff is coming off of the plot has changed. So over the larger plots where you have these large patches of bare ground, runoff is concentrating and forming rills, often as you can see in the photograph at the bottom of the slide in the middle there. So you're getting the same amount of runoff but through a different mechanism. Water is able to accumulate into these concentrated flow paths. It's a much more efficient mechanism of moving sediment off of the plots. And so what we see in this case is erosion increasing as we increase in spatial scale, which is sort of opposite of the relationship we saw for a well-vegetated site. These are just some additional data to sort of further illustrate that point, that for woodland communities, we often see as we increase the amount of runoff, at least at the plot scale, we increase sediment yield. That's the graph in the upper left there. That relationship's been pretty common across 3 woodland sites that we've looked at in the Great Basin. And again, that relationship is largely related to the accumulation of runoff over those large bare areas and the formation of concentrated overland flow into rills, and that increasing the amount of erosion from the plots. And what we've seen across the sites that we've studied, you can look at the graphs on the right side of the slide, the upper being runoff and the lower graph being sediment yield, that as the percent bare soil and rock, or if we lump those into bare ground, increases to about 50 to 60%, we start to see an increase in the rate of erosion. So that's increasing as you move to the right side of the graph there. And so again, that's sort of the connectivity of processes at play, illustrated by the change in the amount of bare ground and what that does to the runoff and erosion rates. So the next question is, what happens with fire? We've repeated these same types of experiments on burned woodlands, both in prescribed fire and wildfire. In the case that you see here, this is for a wildfire in southwestern Idaho. And again, before the fire would have occurred, the processes are well connected at the site. There's extensive bare ground. You have rain splash, sheet flow, concentrated flow processes, all active. But fire sort of superimposes another variable, and that's an increase in the amount of sediment that's available for delivery off of the plots. And so there's the sort of dashed line there at the bottom of the graph that illustrates what I showed on the previous slide, that upper left figure where runoff and erosion have that linear relationship. You can see that in the same graphic here for the unburned plots at the bottom. But that exponential deviation shows the effect of superimposing on the process connectivity an increase in the amount of sediment available. So fire removing litter exposes more of the surface to erosion processes, and given the processes are already connected, we've got a mechanism to move that sediment off of the site. And so in particular for the trees, it's interesting to see how the red ovals there illustrate that for the unburned condition, those are well protected locations on the site, as we would all expect. But they become the most erodible sections on the site, indicated by the oval to the far upper right once that litter is removed. So again, this is just illustrating the effect of process connectivity and then superimposing on that with fire and increase in the amount of sediment available for moving. So we can use the rangeland hydrology and erosion model here to look at sort of hill slope responses. This is a model that's been built specifically for this purpose. And I constructed a couple of model runs for the two conditions you see here, woodland and an unburned condition and a burnt condition. The four graphs that you see there moving from left to right on the top, the first one is just the amount of precipitation we're using in the model to predict runoff and erosion at the annual time scale, and then at the 2 to 100 year return interval event scales. The upper left is the precipitation. The far right on the top is the runoff for burnt and unburnt conditions, burnt being the black bars and unburnt being the gray bars, which I hope are visible. But what I really wanted to point out here is so that effective process connectivity and sediment availability, they show up well in these in the model runs. So on the bottom left, we've sort of built the model without the process connectivity. So we've removed concentrated flow erosion from the model in that case. And then in the far right on the bottom, we've added concentrated flow into the model. So that's sort of bringing into the model the connectivity of processes. And then having burnt versus unburnt conditions illustrates the effect of that increase in sediment availability. So what you see if you look at the red ovals is for the case without the process connectivity. So for the case of splash and sheet dominated erosion, those erosion levels are about tenfold less than when we have the process connectivity on the right, when we add in concentrated flow mechanisms. And then the black and gray bars illustrate the differences in sediment availability with fire or without fire. So here I have the same type of model run for a different site. You can see the site here in the photographs. This is really just to indicate what we've heard from other talks. Not all sites are the same. The model runs are essentially the same here. They're showing the same types of relationships, and increased erosion with concentrated flow as a dominant mechanism, fire superimposing increase in sediment availability. But the magnitude of the responses here are 20 to 60% greater for this site, the Oniki site, versus the previous slide, which is Marking Corral. And that's what I'm indicating there, 20 to 60% greater than Marking Corral, the previous slide. So this is just to illustrate, we know that all sites are different, and the inherent site characteristics like soil erodibility can be a big factor as well. So I've talked so far really just about intact woodlands and how they respond hydrologically, as well as what the effect of fire is on that response. And now we want to move more to looking at the effect of different tree removal treatments in woodlands and how vegetation and hydrology responds. We'll do that quickly with a couple of slides. What you see here are two different woodlands that were burned through prescribed fire. The two photographs at the top represent the different sites, and then there's a single interspace plot in the middle. And then at the bottom of those same two sites, 9 growing seasons after the prescribed fire, and you can see the substantial change in the herbaceous vegetation there that sort of acts to disrupt or break up that process connectivity and limit the sediment availability. And then the picture in the middle at the bottom is the same interspace plot 9 years after 9 growing seasons after the fire. And so what we see from this work is that with that increase in herbaceous cover in the inner canopy, in this case increased 5 to 10-fold after 9 growing seasons, runoff and erosion were 2 to 5-fold less as we went from the small plot scale to the large plot scale. So we have small plots that we simulated in this case too. So there's a decrease in runoff and erosion with increasing spatial scale 9 years after the fire, which is a reverse of what the relationship was in the beginning. So again, we're seeing the slides, or the photographs at the top of the slide, is sort of the case with processes well connected, and then a change in that over time with the increase in herbaceous vegetation disrupting those processes. The same thing can be seen here with some figures and data from multiple sites where there was tree cutting involved. In the case of the photographs on the left, we really saw no change in that sort of immediate post-cut period. The vegetation obviously hasn't had a chance to change, but we were looking at the effects of just dropping trees across a plot. Does it disrupt the flow enough to reduce runoff and erosion? And you can see if you look closely in the figure there's rills in that bottom left figure. Basically, the water routes around those trees or through them because when you first cut them, they kind of lay over like a ball on the surface, and water can route through voids or around the tree. So there's really no initial effect. But as the three photographs show on the right side there, over time, as that herbaceous cover comes in, there's an increase in available soil water there. Bruce Roundy has some nice work on that shown in a rangeland ecology and management paper from the Sage Step study talking about the increase in soil water availability. And what that does for the herbaceous community, you can see a decrease in bare ground from, I think, 85% to about 40% over a 20-year period after cutting, disrupting the processes and reducing erosion. So again, back to this idea of process connectivity, it's kind of what I've been talking about, but it's a good way to think about hill slope processes. With the intact woodland, processes are well connected there. The aim of treatments in woodlands, if you're trying to restore them back to some other previous state, if it's a woodland encroached site, it's really about disrupting that process connectivity. This is a nice photograph of a site in Utah immediately after prescribed fire. And then I think that's 8 growing seasons later. And you can see the change in the herbaceous vegetation. So, with fire, there's an initial increase in the hydrologic vulnerability, so runoff and erosion may increase. But over time, if we can disrupt that process connectivity, there can be a massive decline in the amount of runoff and erosion that can occur. So this is the last thing I'll talk about. This is some of the watershed scale work that we've been doing. This is work from the ARS in Boise in collaboration with the ARS office in Burns, Oregon. We have 4 watersheds in southwestern Idaho where we've been tracking the distribution of snow and what that means in terms of water availability and stream flow. And we will be removing trees in portions of those watersheds and then tracking those changes over time as well, how the tree removal affects vegetation as well as hydrology. And so this initial work here is looking at snow distribution and stream flow for the intact woodland, and then we did some modeling work based on our understanding of sagebrush systems to look at what the differences might be in water availability for these 2 conditions. And I think the 2 photographs probably show best what we found so far through this modeling effort, is that in the juniper dominated condition, or for the woodland, snow tends to be more evenly distributed. For the sagebrush systems, we tend to see snow form in these drifts, and that drifting tends to prolong snow cover at the site, which has an impact on water availability, actually lengthening the stream flow period into the summer months. So the distribution of snow has an important role on the timing and the delivery of water in the system. And I'll be talking more about that later. There'll be a talk in the afternoon session to cover that specific study. That work's covered in this Science to Solution article here from the sagebrush, or from the Sage Grouse Initiative, and then of course the paper's available in Rangeland Ecology and Management. It's an open access paper. So by way of summary and concluding remarks, it's not personal. I don't have anything against the trees. I feel like I talked a lot about maybe negative sides of trees, and Bruce Roundy, he's here today. He led a talk one time with, what do we have against these trees? What kind of problems do we have with these trees anyway? We don't have anything against them here per se, but more or less just trying to explain hydrology for with and without trees. And we know that not all woodlands are the same. A lot of what I talked about today are woodlands where the inner canopy is very sparse, and in conditions where that inner canopy is not quite as sparse, maybe the runoff and erosion responses wouldn't be the same. Again, I sort of try to always think about this in terms of how the vegetation is influencing the hydrology and how the hydrology might influence the vegetation later, which is what we see in the case of the snow cover study that I'll talk about later today. But overall, hydrology and erosion responses are regulated by process connectivity and the availability of sediment. And the magnitude of responses are governed by those things that I refer to as sort of hydrologic or site vulnerability, but also the magnitude is influenced by how much we stress them, so how much water we infuse into that system. And then trees can exert strong influence on the timing and amount of water availability by affecting the distribution of snow and melt, and I'll talk more about that again later today. And certainly from the work we've been doing, I think we've greatly increased our understanding of processes and our ability to predict responses from plot to hill slope scales and even at watershed scales. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done across those larger spatial scales. We've also been working to incorporate this kind of information into ecological site descriptions as some of our more recent work. There's a paper in Rangelands, the most recent issue, that sort of is a shorter summary paper of a larger paper that we did in rangeland ecology and management last year. And I'll have a poster here in about 5 minutes in the ballroom behind me that sort of showcases that work. And that concludes my talk, other than I would like to say that this work is really a lot of collaboration across multiple ARS locations within RCS in terms of the model development, and certainly with the land management agencies and even with private landowners that have contributed space for us to go do this work and have been interested in the results and working with us to that end. So thanks. So I guess we have 1 minute for questions. Hi. Yes. All right. Thank you. Oh, so what she's referring to is recently Fred Pearson and I put together a pretty detailed synthesis of fire impacts on hydrology. Much of the work that you see here today is included in that, and that document's available online. Can't remember exactly the title, but if you do a search for fire and hydrology and rangelands, it should pull up. And there's some copies available here, I guess. We're located where? At the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange desk. All right.
Thank you.
I've asked you this question before, and I want to commend you on looking up the processes, because that hasn't been done very well before. Hydrology is certainly would find that well, but the Oakey and marking for outside vary so much. Have you thought about that? Why? Because much more runoff.
Yeah, so the question really is about, we have multiple sites that have very different responses in terms of the amount of erosion that are coming off of those two sites. And in the papers we've produced on those, we've talked a lot about differences in inherent soil properties and erodibility. And I know, Bruce, around you asked the question, you've done some work in some very erodible soils south of where these studies are. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about the process connectivity, and that gives us a conceptual way to understand how these systems work. But then, if you're looking at an individual site and wanting to predict something about the magnitude of a response, that process connectivity tells you about what's happening on the site, but the magnitude of the response is also influenced by inherent site characteristics. In the case of the two sites, we have differences in soil erodibility, and I think it's important to consider site-specific differences that might also add to the drivers. They're sort of additive in terms of what the process connectivity is telling you.